Welcome to Retro Collect 101, your guide to retro video game collecting. Now, today's video is going to be a little different than my previous ones, and in so much as I'm actually not coming up with a topic this time. This is actually, should we say, an answer to a question posed by a viewer, and that is, or rather, they said, I'm a very young gamer. I'm only 15, turning 16, and I really don't have that much experience in older generation consoles. So how do I know which consoles I should get, or which ones are worth investing in? And I somewhat touched upon this in the past, but really only kind of glanced over it. So I said, you know what, I'll do a video on this, and let's just go a bit of run through history and so on. And I mean, the bit I did touch about before, and that was kind of a piece of advice I would give to anyone who's interested in retro gaming, and that is, if you want to, if you think you might have an interest in getting into retro games, try out compilation packs. They're usually a cheaper and easier way to experience older games without having to maybe go and search out hardware on eBay and pay postage and shipping and all that, and then to find you don't really like them. Now, there's tons of great compilations out there, and just to kind of pick up a few that came to hand, if you're interested in trying the earliest stuff, there's the Atari compilation, Atari Anthology. If you want to try out a great Sega compilation, of course, there's the Sega Mega Drive Ultimate Collection, or whatever they call this. I think it's called Sonic's Ultimate Mega Drive Collection in America. And great pack. This one is highly recommended. It's for the current gen, and it's, what, 40 odd games or something. An absolute must own for any retro gamer, really. And then you have something about, maybe not quite console-y, but you have stuff like the Capcom Classics collections and the Taito Legends, but there's many more. There's Namco Museum, there's Activision Anthology, things like that. There's just loads and loads of compilation packs. Now, you do have the separate thing about, are these compilation packs any good? Do they really replicate the experience? Are they accurate emulation? And yes, that varies. Now, you could say that sound isn't always right, and say this and things like that, and you'll never come across really a package that's going to be 100% accurate, because it's software emulation. It's always going to have difference. But some of them are good enough to give you that kind of taster. I like that type of gameplay. I'll explore it a bit more. But for this particular video, what I'm going to do is kind of go through the generations and kind of just talk a little bit about the consoles and what personally I feel they have to offer, and maybe if that sounds like it appeals to you, and you've want to kind of go beyond just trying compilation packs and things like that, maybe digital downloads, you can say, oh, okay, I'll try that system out. And just one other caveat. One, I'm going to just deal with consoles because that's what the person asked me, and that means I'm going to not do computers, home computings, Commodore 64, Spectrum, Amiga, so on, and handhelds, Game Boy, Game Gear, Lynx. There's plenty more, and maybe they could be a topic in their own right. So, let's whisk all the way back to the 70s now, and we're virtually going to the Atari Anthology line of things. You could say Pong consoles are a start, but really I would step beyond the Pong consoles. If you've played one game of Pong, you've played them all pretty much. So you really are interested in the interchangeable cartridge machines. First one, Channel F. Would I say that is a machine to get into? Not really. It's very historically important, but it's got a limited library. It's a little awkward to get if you're not in America, and it's just not something that's going to offer you a good return, shall we say, on investment, unless you really are looking for a historic piece. Now, when you're talking about early interchangeable machines, as I touched upon, you can't miss the Atari 2600. It basically defined, the early video game era. It wasn't the first by any means, but when you see that, the joystick, when you hear the sound effects of early machines, it is the Atari, that guttural sound. And there's many classics, even from the launch game, Combat, Space Invaders, Yar's Revenge, the Activision games. There's just so many things. Adventure, early, kind of light Zelda type of things that really cover a broad spectrum. And it's a relatively plentiful machine. You can either get it in one of its original variants, the 6-switch, 4-switch, Junior, or, and this is what I would perhaps recommend, you might want to try a 7800, which is basically the bigger brother. You could almost call it like a super 2600 because it's an extension of that architecture. So basically a 7800 plays all the 2600 games, or pretty much all of them, and it has its own library of games, not a massive library, relatively small, but there are some gems in there. Some of my favourites, like Atari Warriors, I enjoyed a Double Dragon. There's a good version, I think, of Galaga, things like that. So it has its own nice little library too. You may find that a little more expensive, so maybe you might not find it worth it because the library is slim, but it's a nice system should you want to kind of, it's kind of like getting a PlayStation 2 instead of a PlayStation 1 because, well, you can play all the PlayStation 1 games, that type of thing. Now, at the same time, of course, the Atari wasn't just running away with, an open market. There was lots of competitors. There's Intellivision for a start, decent system, and like I'm going to say about most of these consoles, by and large they have broadish libraries of games, and if a system will suit you is really down to your preference and game style. If you're interested in fighting games, or maybe certain consoles might suit you more. If you're interested in shooting games, certain consoles might, so it depends on what type of games you're interested in. But generally you could pick up any of the big selling systems and there will be some games in the genre that you enjoy. And certainly if something is as popular as the 2600, there's definitely going to be, a broad spectrum for you to pick from. A little less so with stuff like the Intellivision, and even then things like the ColecoVision. Both interesting machines, not so sure about the controllers, which might put people off. A little harder to come by, maybe a little more of monetary investment, and the catalogues are smaller. On the flip side, some would say that the catalogues are stronger, that the actual ratio of good to crap games is in their favour. I haven't as much experience in those, so I can't really comment, but they are interesting alternatives if you wanted to go down that road. And for this entire period, kind of from like say the late 70s to the early 80s, I would say if you're interested in arcade style experiences, high score challenges, that sort of thing, most of the big systems from that era are worth getting into because they all kind of have games along that line. If you're looking for something very unique, a Vectrix is worth getting into, but that one is pricey. It has its own integrated vector monitor. It's an absolute joy to play in person because of that. Like if you're used to playing on a modern TV, it's kind of like you haven't seen anything like it. When you play a vector monitor, it sometimes looks as good as something like Geometry Wars on the 360. That is remarkable for a system that's the better part of 30 years old. So, it is an interesting experience, but a little pricey. So, you have to take that into consideration if you're just starting out with consoles. So, there's plenty of other systems in that area too. Hence the kind of crash. There was the 5200, there was Arcadia thingy, Ballyastrocades, and Emerson Vision. Or I'm probably mixing up names here because frankly there's so many, they all blend in together. If you're just getting started, I wouldn't recommend those systems because they're awkward to track down and they don't have as big a library for you to kind of pick and choose from to kind of meet your needs. Kind of start maybe with the Atari and expand out if that type of high score arcade games appeal to you. Now, as I mentioned, that kind of brings us up to what seems to be called in America the crash era. Was no crash over in the rest of the world, but we'll say the crash era. As I said, I wasn't going to go into computers, so the next kind of logical system, I guess, is the Famicom / Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, it really is a question of taste, but I would say it's very hard to miss a Famicom, or I don't know why I'm calling it a Famicom today, a NES out of your collection. The library is big and quite diverse, and it's also notable in a change in gameplay experience. If you had an Atari system or one of its kind of peers, you had that arcade experience. And the NES has that too, but it also starts to bring in the kind of Super Mario Brothers convention. You start at level 1 and you have an ending, when you beat Bowser at the end of 8-4. There is a beginning and there's an end. In earlier systems, it tends to just loop around, so there's more of just chasing a score. That changed with the NES. And if that sort of completion appeals to you, well, the systems from, shall we say, the second 8-bit era, the NES, the Master System, and of course maybe the Atari 7800, but to a lesser degree that one, might appeal to you, because the games have been refined a little more, but they still have broad catalogues. Now, they probably excel at the 2D platformer in this era, and by they I mean the NES and the Master System. Both of them I would recommend. They're both good systems, and they both have good libraries of games. If you're in America, Master System maybe not so much, because it only has 100 odd games, whereas if you're in Europe or Australia, or even Brazil, it has a much nearer to 300 games, so there's much greater depth to the library. But either way, for both systems, the predominant genre was 2D platformers. So you're basically your Mario, your Sonic, your Alex Kidd, your Wonder Boy, Metroid, Castlevania. Great franchises started off on these systems, or kind of had key installments, particularly on the NES for the Nintendo franchises. You look at Mario, you look at Zelda, you look at Metroid, Kirby, they were either, as I said, the start of the franchise, or where it was really kind of driven home, this is a big tier title, a franchise that's going to have legs now for 20-30 years. If you want to see how those franchises began, definitely a NES is the way to go. Now, the thing about the NES, in my opinion, is that there's a lot of average games. And you could say the same about the 2600, and maybe that's just a side effect of being really popular. You have these great titles, the upper tier titles, but then you have to be careful to avoid a lot of the middle and stuff. A system like the Master System probably has less of that, but you could still go get a Master System and get a bunch of the kind of cheaper, lesser impressive games and be put off the system. You could go and get a Master System and maybe get Transbot and a few games of that ilk and go, oh, it doesn't really have much to offer. But dig deep and you will find a lot of great games in the library. And it really does touch a lot of bases. Maybe for both the NES and the Master System, there's weakness in things like RPGs. You have things like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy on the NES, and Phantasy Star on the Master System. But it's a genre that probably hasn't aged as well. So if you're coming from the modern perspective and you're used to, say Dragon Quest 9 or Final Fantasy 13, things like that, you may find it too much of a step back, although it is an interesting historical look. So you can't go wrong either way. Bottom line, those systems are good systems and well worth investigating, and relatively cheap, certainly on the Sega side, a little less so on the Nintendo side, because it has, Nintendo still make consoles, their systems tend to command more money, and they also, from a collector standpoint, they went with cardboard boxes, something I didn't touch on with the 2600 and the earlier systems, but cardboard boxes make it awkward to collect complete in box, so you may end up going for just loose carts, whereas Sega tended to go with plastic clamshell cases, which make it a lot easier to go for complete games, or at least boxed games, and that's nicer to collect for. So anyway, we leave those two aside because they're recommended. You then go to what I'd call a sort of a hybrid system, and that's the PC Engine / the TurboGrafx. Now, there we go. In fact, the TurboGrafx thing, if you can see it up in the camera, I'm not too sure. It's sort of a 16-bit system, and it's still an 8-bit system at heart because it's CPU and it's part of its architecture is 8-bit. So it's really an 8-bit core with a 16-bit graphics processor, and you can sort of tell that in the games. They do look a step above the Master System and the NES, but they don't quite have the oomph that some of the SNES and the Mega Drive games would end up getting. And for the first time, I would say that we have a system that didn't necessarily excel at, say, 2D platformers or arcade games. Its real strength is in shooting games. If you like shoot 'em ups, then you definitely should get a PC Engine or a TurboGrafx. Now, if you're going to go down that road, you probably need to do a little bit of homework, because as a system, the TurboGrafx is kind of confusing. Or rather, to give it its original name, the PC Engine, it has PC in the title. And when you have PC in the title, it's really that mindset of upgrades and add-ons and changes and tweaks. Now, if you want a complete set, shall we say, you should get one of those Turbo Duos, I think they call, where you have the Hue card slot and the CD drive, because games released on both formats, and you need both basically systems to play them. If you just want to get started, you would probably find a system solo. Certainly in Europe, you can get the UK TurboGrafx fairly easily enough, brand new, 50 quid will do it. So if you just want to try it out, because you've heard a lot about this kind of exotic system in a way, because it didn't get a full release, you can do, without maybe having to try and track down a full CD. And if you like it, you could look for a Turbo Duo. Now, when I say that the system is very dominated by shooting games, that's not to put down the rest of the library, although I would say, if I was to compare it to maybe the NES or the Master System, the rest of the library is maybe a little weaker. It has much more depth in one area, but say for example, excellent 2D platformers would definitely shine more on its competitors. That's not to say it doesn't have good games, like there's the Bonk series, Military Madness, the Crush games. There's plenty of good games on the TurboGrafx, and I'm sure if you liked a little bit of those games but had quite a hankering for shooting ups, you would really like the system. But it's one of those personal preferences. It'll be a system that some people will love and others could pass over. So, moving on, may as well step it up to 16-bit era, and I mean, this is, to me, the closest era in terms of competitors. One hand you have Sega, you have where we have it, I read it, the Mega Drive. And if you want a taste of the Mega Drive, this is the set for you. It's great. Mega Drive has got a great library of games. Very strong in 2D platformers again. The lineage of the NES, SNES was really carried over into the 16-bit era. So you have, a lot of strong 2D platformers. But then you also have things like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, fighting games starting to come to the fore a little bit more as well. Streets of Rage, Final Fight being on the SNES. And while we're on the SNES, because it's Nintendo's 16-bit entry, you have Mario World, you have F-Zero, a lot of the key Nintendo franchises basically got a really good entry, or maybe more than one, on the SNES. Link to the Past, Super Metroid, really defining entries. The NES might have birthed these franchises or kind of kicked them into top gear, but in some cases, some would say that A Link to the Past is the best Zelda game, or Super Metroid is the best Metroid game. It's a system that's hard to leave out, put it that way. In fact, I would say that if I could only have two systems in my collection, which would be like chopping off both my arms and my legs if I could only have two systems, the NES and the Mega Drive would really make great cases for being the two systems. Now, I'm not saying that they would be the only, but they have really great libraries of games, and they have bigger libraries. There's more games on the Mega Drive by far than the Master System. I think there's more SNES games than there's NES games. If you go into Famicom, as a side note, there would be even more, but that gets into importing, and I'm going to try and steer off importing for this video. We might touch upon that in another video. So, you have two great competitors, and to be honest, nearly no matter the genre of game, you're well served on either of those, and they're musts, in my opinion, for getting into as a retro fan. There's other systems that are out at the time. There was the 3DO, the CDI, the Jaguar, Atari's entry there, the Jaguar, if you're wondering what happened after the 7800. Now, I personally don't think that they're worth the investment for someone getting into collecting or just wanting to experience retro. They're more expensive, they're harder to come by, and they have weaker, smaller libraries. Well, and certainly in the CD cases, a lot of them were trying to understand what they were going to do with CD technology, and didn't necessarily utilize it to produce great games in the same way that the 32-bit era of the PlayStation and so on would do. So I would say steer clear of them. And there's also then the Mega Drive add-ons. There's the Mega CD and the 32X, and when of course you combine them all together with the Mega Drive, you get the Sega Tower of Doom. I'm not really too sure how much I'd go into those. I wouldn't go into them straight away unless you were getting a bundle deal or something. Mega CD has actually got over 100 games. It's a decent library and there are good games in there. But a lot of them are really just kind of upports Mega Drive games with CD sound, and they tend to be more expensive again and harder to get, and they're really not ideal for someone just wanting to start to learn about retro and get into it. So very, very questionable, and certainly the 32X has got minimal, the library's only got about 30 odd games, and it's definitely not worth starting off with that unless you become really engrossed in a Mega Drive set. You start playing, maybe start with this, then you go, Jesus, I'm going to get this and experience it on the real hardware. And that's where this actually whole question stems from. Compilations are great, but the experience of playing on the real machine easily beats it. It's not even close. I mean, this can give you a good taste of what the games and the experiences are like, but when you pick up a Mega Drive pad and you play Sonic, it's so much more fulfilling than playing it on an Xbox 360 pad in this compilation, as good as this compilation is. So you might, get your Mega Drive set going and go, you know what, I've really enjoyed these, and then expand out. So anyway, that's kind of what I would pick from the 32-bit era. Maybe it's my preference, but from 8-bit era, very clearly Nintendo and Sega. From 16-bit era, Nintendo and Sega. Earlier than that, you got to give the Ataris a look in, and maybe ColecoVision, less so in television, but maybe. Again, it depends on your preference. If you really like the arcade experience, definitely more towards those versus the more beginning and end type games of the Nintendo and Sega systems. So we're kind of getting a little more modern then now when we kind of leave the 16-bit era and move towards the 32-bit era. So what jumps to mind there is the PS1, PlayStation 1. I didn't get one when that was current for me because I wasn't really interested in the PlayStation, but it is hard to you just can't deny the influence that the original PlayStation had on the marketplace. It made CD gaming something that could be taken seriously instead of what we had before with even the Turbo Duo and the Mega CD, certainly not with the CDI and things like that. Finally we had a system that was CD based and really made sense. Utilise the space in a little more creative manners. The one caveat about the PlayStation is that it is playable without having an original system. So I nearly wouldn't recommend an original system. If you have a PlayStation 3, it's totally backwards compatible to PlayStation 1, or barring being able to plug in your memory cards. So just pick up the games, and play them on your PlayStation 3, or play them on your PlayStation 2. I would say pick up PlayStation 1 games if you feel they're going to be interesting to that they're a genre you like, and try them on your current system. They're usually cheap anyway because they were so common. And other than a few key titles, they don't even attract that much attention, in auctions anymore. It's a good system for those looking to try out new things, and have easy access with a new, like, PlayStation 3 controller is almost the same anyway, so you're not even getting that disconnect. It's a great system to build up lots of games for. There's a ton of PlayStation games. So it's almost just a yes. PS1, of course. The one thing I would say is, with the PS1, you really have seen a change in gaming. Up to the 16-bit era, it was predominantly 2D gaming. You've seen 2D platformers being a really important genre. With the PlayStation 1 and its peers, it's 3D time. So if you prefer 2D gaming, the systems prior will be something you'll want to get into first. But if you prefer 3D gaming and you're not so sure about 2D gaming, you might want to try some older 3D games, or you might just want to say, screw it, I want to try something I haven't tried, and go 2D gaming. But there is a distinction there that starts with kind of 1995, boof, we go from 2D to 3D almost. Yeah. Now, its peers. Saturn. I'm on the fence. I haven't played enough Saturn to be conclusive on this. But what I will say is, if you go for the Saturn, you are going to probably want to get into importing. And that's its own topic, really. The Saturn was Sega's biggest success in its homeland, Japan, but a relatively bit of a failure in most other places. So it has this strange thing where there's a lot of games, but maybe not where you live. And that makes it hard to recommend when there's also a lot of games that are basically ported on the PlayStation. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. But you want to play Tomb Raider, I wouldn't say to anyone, oh, you got to get a Saturn, you got to play Tomb Raider. The first thing that comes to mind is PlayStation. Resident Evil, PlayStation. It's just Wipeout, PlayStation. There's great games, but a lot of them are also on a much more readily available system. Now, there's a lot of great exclusives, and there are certain games that did really well. Fighting games come to mind: Virtua Fighter, Dead or Alive, things like that. Last Bronx. There's plenty of those games, 3D fighting games, and even 2D fighting games. Street Fighter Collection, Marvel vs. Capcom, things like that. X-Men. So if you're into fighting games, it's a great system to get into. And while we're talking about fighting games, a system I kind of forgot about because of its price. The Neo Geo. It is something you have to know you really want to get into before you get into it. So it's one, do your homework. Kind of like the PC Engine. Incredibly strong for fighting games. Probably the definitive machine for it, in fact. But its other genres a lot weaker. And that comes down to its heritage. It was originally an arcade machine, basically consoleized. So the games are basically just arcade games. And what was popular in the 90s in arcades? Fighting games. Street Fighter 2 just created this massive explosion in fighting games. So, do I recommend it for everyone? No, not a chance. Would I have one? Yes, absolutely. It's a gorgeous looking machine. But I'm not a massive fighting game fan. So I know, just from a practical standpoint, it's not something that I would play all the time. And that's why I would say to a lot of people just getting into it, it's one you have to take under consideration. But anyway, that's the Neo Geo. And we'll swerve back into the other, to Saturn. The Saturn is another under consideration machine. It has a good library of games, but you'll have to work at it. So, whereas I'd say PS1, yep, thumbs up, get games for it. Saturn, maybe. And then on to one that I have great fondness for, the Nintendo 64. That was my kind of system of that era. I love that system so much. It's way better than the PlayStation 1, in my opinion. Now, I know a lot of people will disagree with that. It has a much more library. It uses cartridges when CDs seem to be the future, and so on. But the quality of games, I feel, is just stellar. You still hear about them spoken today. Mario 64 redefined, platforming in a 3D environment and got it right on its first go. Most franchises still haven't made the transition. You have GoldenEye, multiplayer, just insane. Same with Mario Kart 64. Zelda Ocarina of Time, perhaps the best game of all time. Certainly a lot of people think so. Majora's Mask, just as good a follow-up. Smash Brothers debuted in the system. You know, there's just so many great games on that system, and it's a little awkward if you want to get set up and have the best connection to the TV and whatnot. But if you're not looking for that, you can find N64s fairly cheaply. Some places more cheaply than others. And there are definitive classic titles that can only be played on the N64 with the N64 pad. And for that reason, I'm going to say you definitely should try it out. If you've tried it out and haven't liked it, I understand. It's one of those systems that I can see people not liking. But personally, if you like PlayStation 1 era games, the early 3D titles, it can easily hold its head up to those. So, we'll move on a little bit further forward, and we're pretty much getting up to modern stuff. So I'll really only talk about one or two more systems. And the first one being the Dreamcast. Now it's very hard for me to talk about the Dreamcast. And why? Because I don't have one. I've barely even played one. However, I will say that people talk very, very fondly about the Dreamcast. It is a system that has a lot of creative content. Sega were trying new genres and new things, and they weren't afraid to take some risks. I'm not as convinced about the strength of some of the games, just my own personal taste, but I can see why a lot of people do like it. And then it has a side bonus of, I believe, being easy to set up for emulators and whatnot, so you can't go wrong with that. From what I hear from other people, I would say it's a recommended system, basically, but I can't personally comment. Now, last system, because we're really getting up to modern stuff, our last era is the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube. I would disconnect the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast is kind of like the PC Engine in some ways. It kind of sort of is a little before those, but you see certain games on it and go, Shenmue, it holds its own pretty much just as well. So yeah, anyway, PS2, basically get that to play your PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 games if you don't have a PlayStation 3. The library is immense. Thousands of games. And they're cheap. Cheap as chips. Enough said. GameCube. Yeah. If you have a Wii, you're sorted. Or at least a Wii with backwards compatibility. There's great GameCube games. Well worth trying out. You know, Nintendo's key franchises, of course, basically are got good installments on the GameCube. There's, you know, you're always going to get that with the Nintendo systems. Would I recommend it? I'm not so sure. Library's a bit smaller, and of course the Wii kind of handles it to a certain degree. So again, it's one of those maybe systems. And the same with the Xbox. The Xbox is like a massive. It's basically they just got a PC, you paint to the back, turn it on its side. It's big. It has a good library of games. It was the most powerful and probably progressive of the systems at the time, which is unnatural because Microsoft basically just made it an off-the-shelf machine that was a PC type of thing. I haven't really gotten so much into it, but there are great games in it, and some of them you can play on your 360, and some of them you can't. So it really depends on the games that would suit you. If you can play all the ones you want, and most of the ones you want on a 360, and you have a 360, just go for that. Otherwise, you might want to look into it, but again, it's a maybe. So anyway, with that, we're pretty much up to modern day. In fact, really, I would say anything past 2000, you're fairly modern, and most people would be familiar with. If I was to just pick a small handful, if I was to say pick 5 retro systems, it'd be the Atari 2600, the NES, the Master System, the SNES, and the Mega Drive. To me, they kind of bring home big catalogues of great games, kind of ranging from the early arcade experiences to, you know, pushing the kind of 2D boundaries there of the late 16-bit era. And you'll have great fun basically with all of them. So anyway, I've rambled on long enough. I hope this has been some help, and I hope if you're trying to just think about systems, it might give you some ideas where to focus your attention. And if not, ask me a question. And you never know, I might do another video on that topic or whatever. It was actually interesting to be asked and to sit down and think about it. And I hope that that other people find it useful. So, thanks as always for watching, and we'll catch you again soon. Bye for now.